It's weird having all these abstract deadlines, isn't it? Oh, good times. By the way, this is due. Nothing to support it, but it's due. Yeah, that's always fun. Well, it's 9:30. Let's get today going, huh? So it looks like we got quite a bit of people online today versus coming in face to face. So welcome everyone virtually. Welcome you guys who made it to class. I really appreciate it. Let's see here. So today we're kicking off week 4, and today we're talking about the early planning professional. I love today's lecture because it is all about being gross. So we're still in module 2. We're talking about the origins of urban society. Today's roadmap, pretty standard. Today's activity is called Principles of Planning Evaluation. Just some quick announcements for everybody. Idea journal number 2 has been graded. Everyone has been given feedback on that one. Since everyone finished peer reviews of their reflection and synthesis that was due Sunday, I will get those all graded up today with feedback. So that way, for your next upcoming reflection and synthesis due this coming Sunday, you'll have feedback from me about how to do those, tighten them up, or what you did well. And then heads up, if you guys are paying attention to the weather or the news at all, we're under this kind of hardcore smoke advisory right now. Tonight, we're getting a blast of Arctic Canadian air, so the lows are going to drop all the way down to 45. It's supposed to start raining around 5 o'clock and rain/snow all the way through tomorrow. So if you need an extra blanket, pull that out because it's going to be some wild weather for the next 24, 48 hours. That's kind of all the announcements I have to get us going for today. Anything from you guys? No? Again, anyone joining us virtually, if you would like to make any announcements, please do so in the chat. I can email those out later to the entire class as well. So let's get going. Opening circle. What advice would you give to someone who is about to start college for the first time? So think about the start of your year. Think about if it's been a little while. If you had a sibling, a friend, a mentee, someone who is about to start college, what advice would you give them? And those playing virtually, joining us online, please use the chat and respond as well. So I know there's only 3 of us in the class today, but what do you guys think? What's some advice you would give to maybe your former self about starting college? Don't be afraid to ask for help. I would strongly recommend that one because as I've commented before, that's not how we're trained classically in high school, that asking for help is kind of like a sign of weakness, that maybe you're admitting you don't understand. But in college, we love it because not only are we developing students, we're developing future researchers and people in our profession. So yeah, I'm down with that. Well, any last minute advice? No, it's all good. How do you know your advice is good? So since we only have one question, one statement that was thrown out, how do you know that your advice to ask questions is good advice? What was that? Just when they ask questions itself? Okay. And I kind of jumped ahead a little bit on this one, right? Because I kind of threw it out there that we as professors and we here at academia, questioning and discussioning is what we're all about. We're not necessarily seeing questions as a sign of weakness. We want to be able to have a good conversation. So hang on to that one, comes back around. So just to pick up from last week, we've been kind of talking about theory from a historical perspective, from this really kind of broad level, right? Where really the theory of the world and the theory of cities has kind of been, or the history of cities has been more theoretical. And granted, we did ground it in some pretty broad practice, right? So these are things that were physically built that do represent the idea of urbanism or the planning of cities beyond theory. But that's not really the whole story, because when we take a look at early portrayals of cities this is generally the kind of history we're given, where everyone kind of had really fancy silk dress, the streets were clean, cities were sparkling, the water was clear, there was some sort of formal societal social process where everything seemed to work perfectly, but that's not really the world that we lived in. And so in reality, this whole time we've been talking about the beautification, the built environment, just truly how wonderful cities were from a historical standpoint. But the truth is, early cities were really gross. And the simple fact is that we had constructed the built environment, the city around us, faster than the functions that it actually needed to support, not only the city, but the people. So you can see down here kind of a political cartoon representing all the pollution, the smokestacks. So all these folks here are capitalists, represented by the smoke put out by their factories. This is the reality of New York for an early city. You can see just truly how many animals and people and things are crammed into the streets. These were pretty much what we would consider like the early suburbs or the slums of the city, the informal city establishments before the formal city began to give rise around it. And then we also kind of have this really interesting social phenomena kind of represented here in the middle by this drawing, this idea of slumming, this idea of proper society actually venturing out away from their neighborhoods into the city to see how the other side lives, to kind of view poor people as something that should be as a spectator sport almost. And so we've seen versions of this in movies, particularly the one that comes to mind is The Gangs of New York, Leonardo DiCaprio and all those folks walking around. And so that wasn't just a movie plot, this is commenting on reality itself. And so you got to remember that with all this built environment around us, granted historically there's exceptions here and there, that really the modern or the early industrial city, there was no indoor plumbing, there was no electricity, and there was no citywide sewer system, which pretty much means that everything went out the window into the street. This included human waste, food waste, garbage, et cetera, and the expectation was that the rain would just simply wash it all away. The expectation was that the rain would wash it into the river would eventually carry it away, out of sight, out of mind. So even though we tend to portray, as an example here, this gentleman wearing the top hat and the really fancy coat and whatnot, a political cartoon. This is the Thames River in London, and you can see all the dead animals and gross stuff floating around. The political cartoon of the political entity telling the river to give them a call so they can work things out. It's this idea of out of sight, out of mind. But the problem is that when you build the built environment around it to support out of sight, out of mind, it can backfire really fast. So the reality of early industrialized cities is that most of the land where cities were created was flat. It didn't necessarily have a natural slope. So what happened is the way that we tried to solve that problem is that we would build cesspools, which were essentially big drainage ponds. So essentially a giant hole in the ground that you would fill up with human waste. And this was generally if you had money back out behind the house in the garden, or it was right under the house. And so this included upper class folks. And so while you look at a scene like this and kind of see all these people very fancily dressed, all this decadent furniture and expressions of urbanism, they're essentially just one floor above a giant cesspool. And you can understandably expect that the smell was awful. This, of course, included everyone, so rich and poor alike. This is another artist representation. You can see the people here basically avoiding all the sewage, raw sewage out in the street. You, of course, have kids playing in it. It was popular back then for people to actually go down into the sewers and dig around for precious items that people had thrown away or discarded that they could then use for themselves or resell. So it was pretty popular to go into rich areas that did have some kind of minor sewer system into it and go and dig for artifacts. And so, as you can imagine, this is pretty gross. Now, what really made this challenging, of course, is that when we're talking about urbanism, it's not just that we need to get garbage and waste away from the places we live. We also need to bring in resources. So in this particular case, water. Now, the problem was that the way we designed early cities is that the water pump was generally about 50 feet away from the cesspools. So as you can only imagine, of course, cross-contamination did occur. But the challenge is that during this time, we didn't know yet about bacteria and antimicrobial infections and things of that nature. So we didn't really understand that this was a problem at the time. And so before the era of cars, and just to kind of frame this, the way we generally talk about transportation pollution today is, of course, what's emitted from our tailpipes. But we actually had this exact same problem in pre-industrial cities or early industrial cities, where pretty much the horse was the leading mode of transportation. So the main source of pollution pre-car was horse manure and urine. And of course, since the land was so flat, a lot of this would just pool up in the cities. It actually got so bad that folks had to navigate it while walking the streets, and we'll see a few pictures of that here. So when you cram all these people into all these different buildings, this was the built environment at the time of early industrialized cities. So over here you can see, again, New York, and over here is Victorian London. You can see that buildings are about 5 stories high, and this is because this is what technology allowed us to build at the time, because everything was still largely being built out of wood and brick. And so again, if we touch back to this introduction of new urbanism, this idea of the modern city of being a place where we live, work, and play, well, again, this is not an old idea. So as you can see down here in the shops, your first story is where everyone shops and works. Right above that, you have 4 stories where people are living. And again, usually the poorest were on the top in the cities because it was largely believed that only poor people should walk, the rich shouldn't have to walk. Now, the challenge is that at this time, people were flooding into cities. And as we'll point out in later discussions, is that the Industrial Revolution kind of gave rise to this notion of really dense population, of really dense people living in really dense spaces. And so we have the rise of the tenement house. And so in tenements, the challenge, of course, was that you had multi-generational families living in extremely small, cramped spaces. And as we'll see here in a few more images, they're often windowless. And again, at this time, there's no running water, no indoor toilets. And this included the upper class, right? So it's not just poor people had no access to toilets and running water, it was the upper class as well. And so as you can see from a few images here, here's kind of the early bachelor pad where you had unmarried factory workers all living in the same space. You got one guy there, one guy there, one guy there, one guy there, one guy's feet over here. You have a multi-generational family in this picture. You can see this gentleman sewing, possibly to bring in extra income, clothes hanging up there. Kids sleeping on the straw floor and on beds. This guy clearly looks stressed. And then we have an actual photograph over here of I believe it's New York, of a New York City cop inspecting one of these tenement housings. And so as you can understand, the built environment was pretty gross and pretty deplorable. So in the era of early tenements, when we don't have all the technology that we have today, consider this, right? If you're walking down the street, all you see is this front building facade. And so when you take a look at this, this would be the front of the building over here, and it stretches all the way back. Now, the challenge with this is that, again, these tenements were only 5 stories high because that's what construction allowed at the time, and they were extremely long and narrow. And so you were very lucky to have a window. Usually only the folks in the front of the building had the window, and if there was a street or an alley, all these folks on one side of the building would have windows. You had the cesspools in the basement here. So you can see down here where the waste was collected down into the cellar. And you can see multi-generational families living. So that's one tenement space. You can see the staircase going up. So 1 generational family, 2 generational families, 5 levels down. People also living in the basement as well, down where the waste was. Another set of staircase, another family, and so on and so forth. And so you can only imagine the amount of people crammed in this tiny little footprint of a space. And just to illustrate that a little bit further, here's a shot of New York City with a bunch of tenements. You can see all the trash, horse manure, urine, et cetera, just piled up in the streets over here on the sides. You can also see some early cars over here, but predominantly horses. So just to get an understanding of what living in an early industrialized city was really like is by 1900, there were 80,000 of these tenements built in New York City alone. This represented about 2/3 of the total New York City population living in these tenements, which was about 2.3 million people. So consider this, in this one image alone, there's approximately 25 tenements. There's 100 people living per floor in multi-generational family. Buildings are about 5 stories high, so you do the math, and in this picture alone, if you consider how far back the buildings go, there's 12,500 people living in these buildings alone. Again, no running water, no plumbing, no electricity. So as you can imagine, these early cities were pretty gross. But here's one of the interesting things about how resilient people are. And if you're taking this class from an interdisciplinary perspective, you can really start to see how other disciplines might take a look at a housing situation like this and consider what's happening here. So even with all of these horrible conditions, people still made an effort to beautify their physical space. What do you guys see in this picture that might be an attempt to beautify what we would consider a horrible space? A poster back here on the back wall. I agree. Anything else? Yeah, and then we got some picture frames over here. So what we're seeing is that even though we understandably knew these were horrible living conditions and we understandably made the choice to live in them while engaging in the industrialized, capitalized process, that it was somehow going to provide our family with a better quality of life in the future, we still made an attempt to beautify these spaces. And so, yeah, you can see the circus kind of freak show poster in the back there. You can see some family photos hanged on the wall amidst all this chaos. So there was still this human desire to still live in a nice place or beautify a horrible environment. But the challenge really at the time, besides just human waste, was this idea of the horse manure. So manure literally buried the streets. And so as you can see in this image, here would be the gutter of the street. It's piled roughly about 4 to 5 feet high. You can also see these barrels here crammed absolutely to the top with trash and waste as well. But the thing is that there was no easy answer to this, because in 1890 cities, there was roughly about 300,000 horses per city. So think London, New York, Philadelphia, et cetera, roughly about 300,000 horses per city, producing roughly about 2 million pounds of manure per day. But the challenge is that you need horses to support urbanism. You need these animals to be able to bring in goods and export what the city produces. So it wasn't just as simple as, well, this is an easy fix, we just get rid of the horses. Well, then how do you transport your goods? How do you bring in food into the city? So in the past, we've talked about this idea of a wicked problem, right? The idea that they're really complex, there's no clear beginning or end. We don't even really know if we've solved it by the time we implement some type of intervention, right? So if horses are the key mode of transportation and carrying supplies in and out of the city, also allowing for the mobility of the citizens, because remember, we were building cities relative to the size of our transportation technology. So now at this time, cities were built around the horse and what the horse could travel. So now if you eliminate horses, now you're discarding the mobility of your citizens. But at the same time, you're burying it under mounds and tons of horse manure. And you can see this gentleman here with an early cart and a trash can, basically using this small little trash can to tackle this big old giant pile of trash and manure. And so for early cities, this is a representation of a wicked problem. We don't really know where it began. We don't really know how to solve it. We don't even really know how to tackle it. But what this did show us, and this is actually one of the early origins of the planning professional, or the profession of a planner, a city planner, is that this idea of horse manure, trash, refuge, I mean, literally if your horse died in the street, they would just drag it over to the side and leave it there. Realize that if we're going to continue to have these big cities, we need big plans to deal with these growing populations. So while all of this horrible stuff had to happen to get us here, at least what it did is it kickstarted people to start to more professionally address the problem. And so this challenge of urbanism is actually one of the things that kickstarted urban planners, because basically it got to a point where people said, you know what, this is too big, I can't deal with it, we need to put somebody in charge of fixing this challenge. And that gave rise to the urban planner. Now, as we discussed also last week, we kind of had this very theoretical idea of the city, that architects and planners really just kind of focused on the city from the built environment perspective. But really little effective change happened at the ground level. So as we saw, even though we had concepts like this for these grand cities, if we saw how people were actually living, it wasn't reflected in the design. So we may ask ourselves, what also sparked planning as a profession in kind of this early time? Well, the story we really like to put out there is the story of Jon Snow. And no, I don't mean the Game of Thrones Jon Snow. Jon Snow, the doctor, in the story of the Broad Street Pump. Now, let's change gears a little bit. Let's get away from horse manure for a second, because that's kind of a gross topic. But let's also kind of talk about another gross topic. So the Broad Street Pump is kind of recognized as a historical event that occurred that showed what happened when you took a really analytical approach to solving planning problems. And so in London, particularly in the Soho neighborhood, we had an English physician named Jon Snow. And John was already kind of an important person in his field because he was already pioneering the use of anesthesia and medical hygiene. This guy was one of the first people to recognize that, you know what, if we're going to be touching people, we should probably wash our hands. So he put forth that idea into the medical field, or at least gets credit for it anyway. And so he also pioneered the use of anesthesia. And the important thing about that is we knew anesthesia. We had that knowledge, but we didn't necessarily think that it should be used on everybody. It should only be reserved as something for important people. But he was actually one of the advocates that said, no, everyone should have access to this. And so if you're into the medical field, or if you're into epidemiology at all, any kind of health care, he is also recognized as one of the modern founders of epidemiology because of this Broad Street Pump and tracing the source of a cholera outbreak in 1854. So let's take a look at this guy's story and think about it in relation to urban planning. So Jon Snow was the first to propose the idea that cholera was happening because people were drinking water contaminated with feces. Seems pretty straightforward. But the interesting thing is that his claims were largely rejected because the community just simply thought, and I mean this by the community of doctors and what people were willing to accept from their doctors, as just too gross. So it's like, John, we're not going to talk about the contamination of drinking water with feces. It's gross. I don't want to talk about it. I'm not going to talk to my patient about it, right? So there was this kind of this social barrier that actually prevented this idea from catching on. And so basically, since his claims were rejected, even after this historical event occurred, he still didn't really get credit for it until much later, because bacteria and viruses weren't actually discovered until about the 1890s. Well after this happened. So he was one of those guys that only gets credit for this mostly after his death. And you can see here's a political cartoon representing, death pumping water, all these people drinking it. This is the original Broad Street Pump. And there's even a bar right next to the original pump named after the guy. It actually turns out that this is not the actual pump. The actual pump is actually inside the bar where the bathroom is now currently located. So inside this bar, there's now like a weird shrine in the bathroom where the pump was actually located. But this is basically the tourist attraction version. And so we kind of got that wrong a little bit too. Now, the interesting thing is that when we think about this happening in an early industrialized city, we do tend to flash back a little bit to previous lectures or previous points in history, because long before this idea of industrialized cities, and here's a cesspool where people were just dumping their waste, people long had an idea of cultivating water and sewer system as completely separate things. As we've shown in previous lectures, even the Romans had the idea that running water was cleaner than standing water, and actually specifically piped it into their public bathrooms and had a plan for sewer systems to wash this water away out of the city without just waiting for it to rain. But again, as we've kind of talked about historically, ideas become lost throughout history, things get complicated, language becomes a barrier, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes it can kind of be weird talking about these modern challenges, knowing that we've actually addressed them already hundreds of years in the past, but again, that was lost. So the interesting thing about this is that the backstory behind cholera and why it was kind of refused that contamination of your water source might actually be the cause of this is because pretty much at this time, the prevailing theory in the 1800s was cholera was spread via miasma. And if you've ever heard the term miasma, it's basically this old school term that just means that disease is spread through bad smells. And this is not just an early theory or a theory that was only around for a small time. When we actually take a look at the outbreak of the plague, and you have the plague doctors who are wearing the beaks, in the beaks of their masks, they would actually put sweet smelling things, because they also believed that the smelling of sweet things would prevent them from getting the plague. So this idea of miasma, anytime a cholera outbreak occurred, like the one we're looking at here, where 500 people plus died, you basically had public health officials just going around the neighborhood looking for bad smells and kind of tracing that bad smell as the origin of the cholera outbreak. Now, the important thing to note is that, this story of Jon Snow is not just holier than thou, like he was ahead of his time kind of person. Jon Snow believed in miasma. But the thing is that he also believed that it was concentrated in water. So it's not that he necessarily knew about bacteria or anything of those notions. It's just that if he smelled the water and it smelled bad, he thought this was the source of the cholera outbreaks. Now, what he did, rather than just putting this out there as advice or putting this out there as like a best practice, what he actually did is he visually plotted all of the deaths that occurred in the community where the cholera outbreak was occurring. And what he found is that the map all clustered around this one particular community water pump. And so as you can see here, down here we have a blue pump, over here we have a blue water pump, and over here we have another blue water pump. And all these red cases, all these red dots are the cases of cholera outbreaks. And so by visually plotting all the deaths of the outbreak, he was able to confirm his suspicion that cholera was occurring as a result of water contamination. Now, the other interesting thing is that his data also showed that there wasn't everyone across the board near this water pump that was just automatically getting cholera. He actually also found out that the factory workers in the area had much fewer cholera deaths because they mostly drank beer. And so if we flash back to that slide of ancient Sumeria, right, where we actually have evidence of the working blue-collar class after a hard day's work going into bars and having a beer, this is something that passed on all throughout history. And so here you have factory workers who were largely not affected because they were drinking beer. Now, this is before pasteurization, or we actually knew really that beer was safer to drink than water at a microbial level. We knew it socially and we knew it from past practices, but we didn't really understand the science of it. And so if you really wanted to, this is one of those examples where you could argue that beer is really one of the things that made civilization possible. And just to rub that note in a little bit more, Captain Christopher Jones, who is the captain of the Mayflower, the whole reason that we have Thanksgiving and the celebration of the Pilgrims, the only reason he landed at Plymouth Rock is not because he thought it was a good place to land, it's because the ship was almost out of beer. And so it's kind of just one of those really interesting things that depending on what you're into, what your perspective is, you can latch onto one thing throughout history and you can actually kind of use that as a thread to tell the story of people. And so even if having a beer is not your thing, there's many different ways to be able to bring that into the conversation. But as you can see, here's another representation of water pumps. Here's the Broad Street well pump, and you can see all the cases that occurred around it. Now, what makes this story so dramatic, which is why everyone loves to tell it, is that once he confirmed that the water pump was the source of the cholera outbreak, John Snow went out to the well and ripped the handle off in this symbolic gesture and saved hundreds of lives by preventing people from drinking from this well. And so historically, he gets credited for saving hundreds of lives. And you can see from this artist representation here, you know, strong, determined, breaking off the wooden handle of the pump, no problem. You know, and all these people around him, largely women, very concerned about what's going on, not really understanding what's occurring. Now, from a planning perspective, this is one of the things that we like to use that says, well, this is the reason that GIS and other forms of data and map analysis is so important to us, is because early people who were involved in urbanism used data, were able to use these sources to prove their points and to prove that the way that they were designing the city or affecting the city was a good thing. But the thing is we don't even really know if this happened as far as him removing the water pump, or I should say ripping it off. The real story is that, yes, he did think this. He did believe that cholera was resulting as a result of cross-contamination between feces and drinking water, which it was. But the thing, and he did map all this stuff out, and he did determine exactly what we had talked about. But the thing is he never went out and actually ripped off the handle. By the time he actually went out to the government and said, hey, look at everything here, I can prove that this well is contaminating and making people sick, the cholera epidemic in the neighborhood had pretty much burned itself out. The water under the well had already been naturally filtered and passed through, so it was safe to drink again. So it's arguable if he actually saved any lives at all. But the reason that we use this as one of the points of saying that urbanism and the idea of the planner is an important thing is because this is kind of revolutionary, because he did move away from an accepted theory of how the world worked or how the city operated, and actually used hard data to confirm what he thought was a good advice or a good way to design the city itself. And the thing is this is not just a story that just sits out there. It does have lasting impacts all the way through today. So for example, if you've ever been to Chicago, particularly in the downtown area and a little north of downtown, you will see buildings that are not level with the street. They're actually raised up about 5 to 10 feet. And so as a result of this kind of new way of thinking that water as a resource, as a public health, the elimination of our waste did catch on throughout urbanization. And so as you can see here, these were all plans that were designed to raise entire buildings about 5 to 10 feet to use with hydraulic jacks, so they could actually go under the buildings and improve the drainage or make room for the water and sewer lines. And this was a direct response to the typhoid fever and cholera outbreaks that were happening. So it's not just that we were building at the time to support the city itself, but eventually we caught up, our health caught up, our social beliefs caught up to the world around us. And we started changing the way that we design cities to meet that. And so here's some other representations. You can see this tenement house here being jacked up. They're just starting the process down here. They got about a foot off the ground. You would have people manually twisting these hydraulic jacks, and you can see some folks standing on the edge of the building. And then after they got the building raised up, they would put them on these wooden platforms, and this is just an artist representation of a horse pulling this platform and actually dragging and moving this entire building. And in the city newspapers, they would actually make announcements as to what part of town they would actually be renovating, removing, infrastructure that would be moved. So just like today, when we actually have to put in public notices and newspapers about when street design is going to change, or if a new zoning change is going to be made, it's still expressed in the newspaper. And so this kind of relationship is a time-honored tradition, so to speak. But let's shift gears a little bit, because what we've been talking about so far is largely this idea that people have been really in control of the built environment. They've been really in control of every single one of their actions. That everything we've been doing is more or less deliberate. There's always kind of been a plan. But the reality is that most of this stuff just kind of happened by accident as a result of someone making a good or bad decision that made things better or worse. So just as an example, one of the things that we'll be talking about a little bit later when we think about how the bubonic plague actually really did change urbanism is, let's set the stage for that conversation. So the effects of humanity on cities have largely been accidental. And so to show this, let me introduce Pope Gregory IX. He reigned from 1227 to 1241, which is approximately the late 13th century. The reason this guy gets a lot of credit in history is because he instituted the Papal Inquisition. So if you've ever heard of the Spanish Inquisition, a lot of horrible people being tortured under the guise of religious doctrine, this is the Pope that put that into practice. He also established the idea of hearsay, which is the belief that anything discussing, believing, anything other than what the church accepts is hearsay and therefore punishable through the Inquisition. And so he also put this forth as this idea of blasphemy, which was an utterance or an action against God or sacred things. So as you can see, this guy was pretty hardcore in his belief system. But one of the really wild beliefs that he had is that he thought that cats were associated with devil worship. And he referred to cats as the incarnations of Satan. And so what this guy did, as you can imagine, since he put forth people being tortured to death for going against the beliefs of the church or even uttering a negative thing against the church, he had cats throughout Europe exterminated in mass killings. As you can imagine, that if you kill off all of the cats, then the rat population explodes. And we know historically that the cause of the Black Death was from the fleas and the rats being spread out throughout the cities and throughout the area. And so because Pope Gregory IX instituted that all cats should be murdered because they were agents or incarnations of Satan, he inadvertently caused the explosion of bubonic plague resulting in the Black Death. So here we kind of have a weird instance, right, where we have a pope, a historical pope, planning to weaken Satan. But he actually kickstarts the entire downfall of medieval Christianity, because largely what happened is when people, because the Black Death or the bubonic plague became so out of control and prevalent, estimates put it between killing 50 to 100 million, or 25 to 60% of Europe's population. But what happened as a result of this is because the plague was so widespread, the only thing that people were really looking for was guidance from the church. And the church just kind of said, oh, you're being tested. You know, if you put faith in God, you will be saved. Your family will be saved. And as you can imagine, that after years and years of this and not seeing any real results from that, they really actually started to rise up against the church and really started to weaken their authority and not see them as people who guided their lives. And so just because one guy thought cats were agents of Satan, had them killed, kick-started off this whole historic series of events, right? So Pope Gregory IX did not cause the Black Plague. The Black Plague had already been out in little outbreaks, just like cholera outbreaks and whatnot, and would kill off a small amount of people. But because of what he did, causing the boom of the rat population, suddenly made that such a bigger deal. So, of course, that was not a planned event, right? So when we take a look at how cities responded after the Black Death came around, it did actually kind of solve a really interesting problem from the perspective of planners and urbanism and civilization, right? Because essentially at this time in 14th century Europe, there was a huge overpopulation issue. And of course, people were suffering for lack of work, lack of shelter, lack of food. And so kind of one of the really interesting things is that by killing off 25 to plus 40% of the population, that now means you have more opportunity for the people who survived. And so afterwards, people actually saw their wages increase. The cost of living decreased. Wealth became more evenly distributed. Their diet actually improved, and they started to live longer. And so the way people respond, which is the reason that we combine social challenges in this class with the history of urbanism and the built environment, and taking a look at cities, it's because it's not just as simple as the built environment creating how we live. It's people also responding to what's happening in these places as well. Now, it should also be noted that one of the kind of the famous things that also gets credit from this area is that it's believed that Genghis Khan, which of course was the leader of the Mongols, would actually catapult dead bodies infected with bubonic plagues over the walls of the cities he was sieging. And this is often referred to as one of the earliest known accounts of biological warfare. And so it's kind of one of those stories that people like to tag on as we talk about the Black Death and the bubonic plague. But is it true? Probably not. And so the only real story we have of Genghis Khan catapulting dead bodies is actually due to a story that a Greek historian wrote down 1,000 years after Genghis Khan even lived. And so there was no first-hand account. He was basically just basing this off of, some stories that he heard and just finally wrote it down. And then people later discovered that since he wrote it down, thought it was actual part of history. But it's probably not even true that he would catapult dead bodies over the walls. And so this is kind of seen now as like one of those early forms of xenophobia. And so, the fact that the Greek writer who put that down, much of his other work was also disparaging of anybody who was not Greek. And so you kind of have to take much of history with a grain of salt, because sometimes we take a look at these things and discover they're not even true at all. Now, the interesting thing is that the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, is still alive and well. So even though we think we live in this modern era where it's not affecting everybody, if you've lived here in New Mexico long enough, we have about 1 or 2 cases of plague every year. But what's also really kind of interesting is if you have ever referred to your significant other as your boo, or if someone has ever gotten hurt like a child, and you say, "Oh, look at the boo-boo on your knee," right? And you clean it and kind of kiss it or whatever. This is actually a direct reference to the bubonic plague and the Black Death, because as people would swell up or become affected with the disease, their lymph nodes would swell up into these bubbles. And at the time, these were called the boo-boos. And so if you had boo-boos, it was actually the swelling of your body as a result of the Black Death. Now, of course, we use it in this kind of lovingly referring term where if you get hurt, you get a boo-boo, or if you're referring to your significant other as your boo, it's kind of a shortened kind of version of it. So even though we think the bubonic plague and Black Death as this ancient period of history, socially it's very alive and well. So let's jump back a little bit then. So if a lot of these things are mostly accidental, but a lot of people also have a plan, we're talking about the early planning professional and kind of how the planning profession got started. Well, we kind of have this rise specifically during this era of the social worker, of people going out into the cities with a plan. And what they actually wanted to do is they wanted to improve the lives of people living in cities and the people who live there. And so just as an example, you can see this park movement here, where green space suddenly kind of became an idea of a way to kind of tackle these things. And here you can see a mix of factories and tenement housing over here. So basically what the early social workers were advocating for as part of the social justice movement of cities is they wanted cleaner tenements. They wanted spaces for immigrant children to play, so the advocation of parks here. and they wanted more light and fresh air. So even though at this time the idea of miasma and the fact that disease is caused by bad smells, there was still some lingeringness to that still filtered out into a lot of the popular belief. And so even though they didn't quite understand it, they knew that people living in rural areas that had access to the environment, had access to cleaner resources, did tend to live healthier, longer lives, whereas people living in the city, constantly surrounded by the built environment, constantly surrounded by pollution and all these horrible things, they felt that if they could bring in more light, more fresh air, more parts of the rural into these cities, that it would be beneficial for people. And as we know today, that is absolutely the case. But the thing is that as we move out of this historical perspective and we start to really take a look at some modern ideas of planning, and pretty soon we're going to start looking at post-World War II, we're going to start looking at what really happened in 19th century industrialized cities that caused the direct way that we live our lives today, is that not everything, even though it may have been done for the best intentions, was necessarily for the greater good. And so today, we walk around our buildings all the time. We have access to water fountains and things of this nature. But one of the things that actually really kickstarted the idea of water fountains and people having access to water was actually created as part of the temperance movement. And so there was kind of this social movement that said that men drinking alcohol, becoming violent, spending time in bars after work, was destroying the family structure. And so they squarely put the blame on alcohol. And so they thought that if you could provide public drinking fountains all throughout these cities, that they would stop people from drinking alcohol. But the thing is that what this kind of was largely put into place under is that while it was put under the guise of a public service, it was actually fashionable for the wealthy to sponsor the water fountains. And so as you can see here, written on this water fountain is the family name and the family crest of the people sponsoring this water fountain. Metal cups were put on chains and then chained to the water fountain, and so everybody would share the same cup. As you can imagine, of course, the spread of disease and things of this nature, this only encouraged that as well, even though it was done under the guise of a good public service, providing water, stopping alcoholism. But now you have both rich and poor alike all drinking from these kind of fashionable water fountains. And so a lot of what we'll see in our histories is kind of, take it with a grain of salt. And you pass by every single day, every time you pass by a water fountain. So let's wrap things up here. Let's jump back to what we were talking about a little bit last week. And so what we did last week is we kind of talked about the Columbian Exposition, how it was really controversial, how if you go back and take a look at what it was really representing, it was pretty awful from a social perspective. But we've done this plenty of times in history where we take a look at events and we just take the parts we want from them that were good and kind of discard the rest. And so the reason that the Columbian Exposition here gets so much love and is really shown as the thing that kickstarts urban planning. And to expand on what we talked about on Thursday, right? It's not just this idea of the perfect city and cultures on display, as we'll see over here on the midway. It's this idea is that if planners, architects, landscape architects, if all of these people in these different professional fields could come together to create this, then this is really the city of the future because it's free of horse manure. It has clean water, right? So the idea of city beautification, like we did last week, where we emailed in some images to show things that we would like to change around the city. So that's really the reason this gets so much love in planning history, even though the backstory of it is generally glossed over. So as you can see, that with all these kind of things that we talked about today, all of these wicked problems, no clear beginning and ending, very complex, What eventually happened is that because these challenges in cities became so great, they did start funding city planning, the idea of one person in charge, one person with the grand vision to tackle the scheme, the combination of architects, landscape architects and planners would actually give rise to the idea that we can go back and challenge these things. And so as we'll see on Thursday, that this really is the bedrock that kind of gives planners the power, but also the funding to fund that power, to actually make these changes occur. And as we'll see on Thursday, the changes that we used, sure, solved some problems, but also created quite a bit more. And so for closing circle, anyone can give you advice, right? If you're being chased by an animal, just lay down on the ground for 5 seconds. The 5-second rule will prevent the animal from eating you. That's pretty bad advice. So anyone can give you advice, right? Anyone can design a city. Anyone can offer plans or design something. But the real question is how do you know it's good advice, right? So let's take a look at how we might think about that a little bit differently. But before we continue, any questions about what we just talked about today? Those of you watching the class virtually, please feel free to use the chat. I'll get back to your questions after class. All right, let's continue then. So just a quick look ahead to this coming Sunday. That should say the 13th. I apologize, I will fix that. We have got some readings coming up, and again, the readings are not aligned yet to this class. They're kind of running parallel with each other to a certain point specifically. Upcoming, we have reflection and synthesis number 2 that'll be due this Sunday. Again, I will grade reflection synthesis number 1 by the end of today, so you can have that feedback to apply towards number 2. And then we also have the second draft of your bio statement. I've graded and read the vast majority of all the first drafts of the bio statements. And the whole point of that one was to kind of take a look at that assignment by just jumping into it, about really forcing yourself to talk about yourself in third person. This time, if you guys look and learn in week 4, go all the way down to the bottom where the assignment is due, this time there's some scaffolding there. There's some structure to help you that actually write those things. And so you're taking your first draft, taking the advice of how to structure those things, and putting forth a second draft. In 2 weeks, then we'll have a final draft due for that. And again, the bio statement is part of the midterm that you'll be publishing on your webpage. And so this is not just a standalone assignment just kind of standing by itself, right? We're actually doing the work of the midterm, working up to the actual midterm itself. Any questions about that before we move on? No? Okay. All right, so how do we know advice is good advice? How do we know our plans are good plans? Well, as we just kind of talked about today, we had a lot of distress and disillusion that actually created this national need for planning, right? So distress because cities were buried in manure, people were getting sick, water and sanitation was a huge problem, right? The disillusion that if you create these perfect geometric cities that we can live this peaceful, international, perfect kind of life, right? But at this point, as we've seen, the disconnect between how people were living in reality and the plans that were put forth were pretty disconnected. And so at this time, there's little consensus about what should be planned and by what principles. So let's think about this differently. Let's not talk about cities. Let's evaluate cookies. So what I'd like you guys to do is just take a moment and write this down or think about it in your head. I'm going to put some music on. It'll just take a minute or two. Those of you watching the class virtually, please play along as well as part of the class activity today. When you go to the store and buy cookies, how do you evaluate the cookie you're going to buy? Number of chips. Are they chewy or hard cookies? What's your criteria? If you just say that I want a chewy cookie, well, how much is too chewy and how is too little chewy? Do you just base it off a pass-fail? Do you give things an informal Likert scale, a 1 through 5, too chewy versus too hard? So rather than thinking about the city or the neighborhood, or the place you want to build, the place you want to live, and evaluating that. Tell me how you buy a cookie. How do you evaluate a cookie? And again, I'll throw on some music here so we can just have some background. We'll take 2 or 3 minutes to write down some thoughts, and then we'll come back together as a class and share them. Those of you watching the class virtually, if you'd like to add anything to the chat, I will read your responses today in class since we got a little bit of extra time. And you can definitely tell it's a Tuesday after a holiday. While I've been standing up here lecturing, my email has just been like. All right, so while the few folks are still chiming in the chat here, let's talk to you guys. How do you buy your cookies? How do you make the decision? If you can't eat a cookie because of dietary restrictions, how do you choose something else? Okay, so when you're standing there in the cookie aisle, you kind of have this criteria in your head, and you're just kind of checking some boxes, like maybe what's on sale, something you tried before, stuff like that. Okay, fair enough. I like that. I think I like your first statement the most. It kind of depends what kind of mood I'm in. I love some oatmeal cookies. But at the same time, if I'm not in the mood for them, I'm not in the mood for them. But yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things is just looking at the packaging of chocolate chip cookies and how many chips they advertise as part of the cookies, and then you actually open them and you're kind of disappointed by the experience. So, yeah. Now let's take a look at the chat here. All right, Kayla says affordable, not too sweet, good size package. For me, this includes the classic Chips Ahoy or Nutter Butters. Ooh, I like those. Kathy says based on what is in them and if they are chewy. Yeah, not too sweet. Daniel says cheap. I usually buy the $1 frosted oatmeal ones. I've had hit or miss luck with those for sure. Jessica, price, flavor, harder texture is typically preferred. Harper says, are they made by mom? Yes or no? Yeah, that's a good one as well. So here's what I would like you guys to do today informally. This is not an actual assignment. Go buy some cookies. It's going to be cold for the next 24 to 48 hours. On your way home today, buy some cookies. Take the thing that you just thought of today about how you evaluate them and think about, is this cookie you plan to buy again in the future? Did it actually meet your expectations? Maybe go buy a package of cookies you've never had before. See if they meet your criteria. While this may sound a little silly, as we move forward in the class and we start thinking about why people live where they do, if you guys had to move here from another city, like Las Vegas, I can't remember where, Michigan, right? If you moved here from another neighborhood or another state, how did you choose the place where you moved to, the neighborhood? What did you use to evaluate it, right? So while we may be talking something as simple and silly as cookies, the process of human evaluation and how we judge things all the time, including the places that we live, does have both formal and informal criteria. And as we move through the class, we'll actually have a specific activity on that assumption to build from this idea. So that's all I have for today. So we'll get out of here a little bit early. Thank you very much for you guys who made it to class today. I really appreciate it. This class is really for you coming face to face. Those of you joining virtually, thanks for participating today. We'll see you guys on Thursday.